Thanks, Pete. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Great to be here. And we had a fun demo day yesterday. Right now, my colleague Mike Strauss and his wife Kay are handing out this little one sheet. If you were in the workshop yesterday, you already got it. And this is actually some little kind of tips from the ABT framework to help you a bit in terms of what we're talking about here. So let's see if we can get this going. This is the book that I've just come out with, Narrative is Everything. That's the kind of basic message of what I have to share with you today here. But more importantly, what I'm going to talk about in this short little talk is really leadership more than anything else, because I think all of you are probably here for the purpose of leadership. You're hoping to try and lead society away from single-use plastics and the toxins and all those sorts of things. But the first thing you need to know about leadership is that narrative is leadership, and it's extremely simple. It's as simple as this. People do not follow leaders who are boring. They do not follow leaders who are confusing. They follow leaders who are interesting. And the fundamental dynamic that makes the difference between whether you bore or confuse people versus end up being interesting to them is this element of narrative. It's at the core of all communication. It's age-old, and the bad news is it's the toughest part of communication, which is why we devoted so much effort to it. And that's why that's the essence of the book, the title, Narrative is Everything. This book is about the ABT framework we've developed for the last 7 years, and then also some bigger ideas on basically cultural evolution. So this tool, the ABT, stands for and button therefore, and it's the idea of taking your entire message, your whole complicated program and agenda, shrinking it all the way down to one sentence that captures the essence of what the narrative is about, using these 3 words. So, for example, for the entire issue of plastics, we've developed plastics for a bunch of years, and they brought us some good things, but we've got too much of them now, and they're causing problems. Therefore, we need to reduce plastics use. That's the simple, broadest of all narratives for the whole big issue. I'm going to tell you 3 little tales of this ABT in action that hopefully kind of give you an idea of how powerful it can be. So here's the first one. It starts with this fellow, Jeremy Jackson, one of my longtime buddies I used to be a marine biologist. I left that career, became a filmmaker, and now I've circled back to the world of science and environmentalism. And I've known Jeremy for decades now. A couple years ago, he turned 75, and we had a big birthday party for him in New York City in a private room of an Italian restaurant. And a whole bunch of old characters were there. Some people may recognize Enrique Sala, the fellow on the left, and Bob Stenick, one of his graduate students. And basically everybody in the room was 50 years old or older, and as the evening went on, these are people who have known him for decades, and they started telling wonderful stories of Jeremy, one after another. And as I said, everybody in the room was over 50 years of age or older, except one person, the guest who I had brought, my crazy co-collaborator, co-developer of Story Circles, Jade Lovell, 32-year-old Australian, and she was sitting there next to me. And as this storytelling was going on, all of a sudden, she clinked her glass and stood up. And the important thing to notice in this photo are the empty wine glasses in front of her. She'd already had 3 glasses of wine, and she'd known him for less than 6 months. And I was sitting there horrified. What are you doing? You're about to embarrass me in the middle of all these great stories being told. But she didn't embarrass me at all. She stood up and she said, this is such an amazing evening, and you're incredible friends, and these stories are so powerful. But it turns out you could know this guy for less than 6 months, and he could have an impact on your life, which is what happened to me last summer. Therefore, let me tell you what happened, which was I had lunch with Jeremy last summer, and I was telling him about a little health issue that I had, and I didn't think it was a big deal. But he thought it was actually sounded pretty serious. Therefore, he set me up to meet with a doctor that he knew. I went and met with the doctor, told him about it. He didn't think it was that big deal. But then he asked one question, and suddenly my answer to that question made him very alarmed. Therefore, he ordered some tests. The tests came back. He contacted me and put me on some medication. And he said, had you not been in to see me when you did, this could have turned into something even life-threatening. Therefore, you can know this guy in less than 6 months, and he can save your life. And that's how she ended it. And as she said that, the whole room erupted in applause. And as she sat down, she looked at me and said, "Thank you, ABT." And that's what had happened in that moment, was despite the 3 glasses of wine, she used this ABT template to put that story together quickly and get up and do a great job with it, as opposed to just rambling on and on or confusing people, and she would have been cut off had that happened. And that's how powerful it is. And if you want someone else who could tell you a similar story, my good friend Anna Cummins, sitting back there, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, told me she was at a workshop and people were getting up and rambling on, and she had to contribute something. And on the spot, use this ABT structure, this framework to help make sure that you get right to a quick setup, get to the problem, and then really the actions that are being taken to address the problem. So this is what the template looks like. What you don't want to do is get stuck in the land of and. That's what happens with so many scientists that I work with. They never get to the but. They just go on and on. And here's another fact. And here's another. And. That's what you don't want. That's the non-narrative template. What you want is to tap into this power of narrative, and the way you tap into it is by getting to that point of contradiction, the word but. And that's what you see. And the thing you have to keep in mind, we must all keep in mind, is that the brain is fundamentally lazy. We spend our whole lives being lazy, talking in this non-narrative mode. Most of the day, you're just saying, and I did this, and I did this, and I'm going to do this tomorrow, and I did this, and I think this, and I think this, and. That's what most social media is about. It's all this non-narrative stuff that is very lazy. It takes a lot of effort to get to this ABT structure. This is why communication really is challenging. One of the powerful uses of this ABT template that I hope eventually I can get to some politicians and get them to understand this is a tool to be used, especially for press conferences. If you know there's a certain number of questions that you can predict are going to come to you, you should be rehearsing this ABT structure in advance to make sure that you don't fall into an and answer or a DHY answer where you're going all over the place with too much narrative. By the way, this person has very strong narrative intuition. I've analyzed 3 of her speeches so far, and you can see the marks in her use of this basic ABT structure. She's got it, and I think she's one of the best communicators out there right now. Second little story, I am a mad keen surfer over the years, and one of my very best friends is one of the world's most famous longtime surf photographers, Brian Bielman. Here he is dressed up going to his office at work. And I met him about 12 years ago in Fiji. Ever since then, about every year, every spring, it seems like I go over there and hang out with him for a week. He lived in the North Shore of Oahu since the 1970s. And I go over there and we surf the big waves. But a couple years ago, I was over there and he said that this young kid, 29 years old, Brent Storm, had contacted him about wanting to make a documentary about using his photos and surfing. And he wasn't sure the kid knew what he was doing, so he asked me if I would sit down and have a chat with him. So I did. One morning, Brent and his girlfriend came over, and I gave them an hour-long lecture on the ABT and a bunch of little pointers and things, and said, get in touch with me in a couple weeks and tell me what you're thinking for the basic structure. Well, he vanished, and we didn't hear anything from him. And for month after month, I would ask, Brian, whatever happened to that kid? And he said, the North Shore people just flake. But a little over a year ago right now, all of a sudden, Brian called me up and said, guess what? Remember that kid? He and his girlfriend came over last night, and they showed us an entire cut of the movie, and it's really good. And I said, well, I'll be the judge of that. Send it to me. And I watched it, and it was really good. And I was stunned. I ended up talking with him, and first thing he said was, you remember that ABT thing you taught us about? You wouldn't believe how many nights Julie and I would sit there after a whole long night of editing and play back what we'd cut together and realize, oh, my God, we fell into that and thing he was trying to warn us about. And they'd push themselves further to find this ABT structure. So the one thing that was missing in the film was it was a lot of these really good small ABTs over and over and over again, but overall it was kind of flat. It was just a whole bunch of these little vignettes. So it was about the 3 big swells that hit Fiji and Tahiti in 2011, and I set to work with him over the next 8 months doing multiple drafts of it and eventually turning this into a journey that went from the first swell that was big to the second swell that was bigger, and eventually the third swell that was one of the biggest swells ever seen by big wave surfers. It all came together. This is Brent there in the middle. He's done a tremendous job with this. We're a little team now, and this is the movie White Rhino. We're now doing a deal with distributors this next week, and it'll probably be on Netflix in the next year or so. It's been in about 40 film festivals, and it's a really fun movie that's packed full of energy and has great storytelling. It's very tight thanks to the ABT. But that brings, that sort of illustrates part of this challenge of using narrative, which is when you get to these bigger texts, it becomes very challenging. And a prime example of what I just talked about there, which is this multi-layering of the ABT structure, happened last year when Oprah Winfrey gave really semi-legendary speech at the Golden Globes. And I didn't see it, but the next morning I got an email from a friend sending me the transcript. Oprah gave this talk, and basically using this structure that you see on the cards of color coding the text with blue for setup and red for the contradiction and green for consequence. You can, without even reading the text, you can see this ABT cycling structure all the way through it. And overarching, it also had the ABT structure. And the New York Times, when they evaluated it a couple days later, they called it a story made up of stories. That's your ultimate goal. It's very challenging. And last little story is about a couple years ago, I did a podcast, and a guy who was the vice president of global branding for Billabong heard it, used the ABT, thought it was really powerful, invited me to come down there and meet with their global branding team. We ended up in a room with 5 of these, their top 5 people for global branding, gave them the hour-long lecture, and then at the end asked them all to just write down the one-sentence ABT of what they thought the company stood for, and then had them all read their ABTs. And what we found was one after another, they completely differed from each other. The first one thought that the company was about authenticity. Next one thought it was about celebrity athletes, on and on. Got to the end, and the boss turned to me and said, "Do you think we have a problem here?" And yeah, when you've got complete disagreement on what the narrative is of your company with your 5 branding people, that's probably not a good idea. So that's where the ABT can be used as a tool to assess consistency of messaging. And if you've got a team of people working, it's as simple as get them just sit down this one-sentence ABT, write it and compare it. Ideally, it should be identical. So these are just a few of the applications that you can use for this ABT. And in the next couple days here, when you're having these discussions, keep it in mind with this card that gives you a few little pointers. And this is the training program that we now run called Story Circles Narrative Training that we did the demo day for yesterday. And last little thing to share here is Longfellow was a great poet in the 1800s. And he wrote this epic poem called Evangeline. And when he finished it, he sent it to one of his best friends, and the best friend wrote back and said, "I love this poem. It was so easy to read." And what he wrote back to him was, "Evangeline was so easy for you to read because it was so hard for me to write." And that's the essence of what this stuff is about. If you're not finding communication to be really, really hard, you're not doing it right. If you're just slapping stuff together and getting up there and thinking, "Wow, I'm a natural," you probably aren't. This involves a lot of hard work, and that's because narrative is extremely challenging, and narrative is everything. Thank you.